Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two of the most recent stories I've received, both still unfolding to this day. Each one centers around someone who decided to buy a home in the Appalachian Mountains. But things haven't exactly gone as planned. From completely unhinged people breaking into homes, to strange things moving through the woods, these stories are far from over. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. My wife and I moved into the Appalachians a little over 3 months ago. We left city life behind, Louisville to be exact, for something slower and quieter. I work remotely now. Tech stuff, so the location didn't matter. Leah had been pushing for years to get closer to nature. We found a 2-bedroom cabin on about 3 acres of land, just off a long, winding mountain road in western North Carolina. It backs up to a steep, wooded ridge, thick with pines and silence. My wife grew up very close to this area, and spent a large part of her childhood playing in the Appalachian forests. So ever since she went off to college and ended up living with me in the city, it was like the forest had been calling her back. We always knew that sooner or later we would try to live out here. So when we finally made it happen, for her, it was like a dream come true. The closest neighbor is half a mile down the road. That was one of our favorite parts about living there. We liked the space, the fresh air, the sound of wind in the trees instead of traffic and sirens. On top of that, we'd had some issues with neighbors in our old apartment building, so not having to deal with people was absolutely wonderful. At first, everything was perfect. Kind of like a honeymoon phase. But around 6 weeks in, things started happening. It began small, practically insignificant things, easy to overlook. The back gate, which I always lock before bed, would be swinging open in the morning. Just once, then again a few days later. I assumed it was the wind the first time. By the third, I replaced the latch with a stronger one. Still, I started waking up earlier to double-check the property. Once, I even took a flashlight and walked the perimeter at 3:45 in the morning. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. I've always been a very rational person, so when I first had that creeping sense that I wasn't alone, I told myself it was perfectly natural. It was dark around me. I was in a new place, surrounded by dense forest. It was normal to feel afraid, almost instinctive to be afraid, and it was also normal for the mind to conjure up scary scenarios. I convinced myself it was all just monkeys in my brain. I turned back toward the house, but when I glanced up at the ridge behind it, I thought I saw something glinting. Ever since we'd arrived, that ridge had been particularly dark, so anything not quite as dark stood out. I stared for a few seconds, trying to make out what it could be. Maybe a reflection of something. It wasn't moving at all, so it didn't seem like an animal. Eventually, I ignored it and went back to bed. A week later, Leah found one of my shirts out in the woods. It was a flannel I hadn't seen in a while, one I thought I'd lost during the move. It was lying folded, neatly, on a tree stump about 30 yards into the woods behind the cabin. It was completely clean, as if it had just come out of the laundry, been ironed, and placed there. No dirt, no pine needles, not even a wrinkle. I hadn't been out there with it, and I definitely hadn't folded it like that. We were obviously disturbed by it. Me, because I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't done it. And Leah, because she didn't know what to believe. She asked me several times if I was sure it wasn't me. Asked if I'd ever had episodes of sleepwalking. After repeating over and over that I hadn't, she said maybe we'd dropped a box during the move and some stuff had blown out. We both knew that was ridiculous. Not only had it rained for the past 2 days, but we hadn't even passed through that part of the property during the move. Honestly, my first thought was that Leah was trying to prank me, trying to spook the city boy. She'd always said living in the Appalachians wasn't for the faint of heart, so maybe she was trying to scare me a little. But I knew her too well to believe that. Her voice, her eyes, that was real fear. She hadn't done it. Then came the trail markers. Bright orange plastic tags tied to branches. They hadn't been there when we moved in. Someone was marking a path through the woods behind our house. I followed them once, just far enough to feel unsafe, and once again, watched. I thought about saying something to Leah, that someone had been near our property, but she was still rattled from the shirt incident, nervous that someone had broken into the house, so I didn't want to scare her more until I was sure something bad was really happening. I didn't have to keep the secret for long, because after I'd been on the trail with the markers, things escalated fast. Late one night, we were woken by a single loud thud on the back porch. Not like an animal or a tree branch falling. It was clearly something deliberate. I grabbed the pistol I keep in the bedside drawer and went to check. The porch was empty, but the gate was wide open again. I stepped out with the flashlight, swept it across the yard, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I shouted into the night that whoever was out there should show themselves. That we were armed and the police had been contacted. And then, from the trees, a man emerged, completely naked. He came just close enough for me to see his face and body clearly, then smiled and told us that if we didn't leave his property, something very bad was going to happen. Then, he made a gesture that left no room for doubt. He closed his right hand, raised it to his neck, stuck out his thumb, and dragged it across his throat. I raised my gun even higher, but there was no denying I was terrified. Everything about it was off. I told him the house was ours, that we had bought it, and repeated that the police were on their way. He simply said we had been warned. Then he turned around and walked back into the trees. If it had happened now, I would have gone after him, tackled him, waited for the police to show up. But in that moment, all I could think about was how bizarre it all was. I looked back toward the house and saw Leah standing at the door. I told her to get back inside, to check every door and window while I called the police. Even though we were in a relatively isolated area, the police were surprisingly quick, or at least much faster than I was expecting. In about 18 minutes, they were there. They searched the perimeter of the house, but after over an hour, they came back saying they hadn't found anything except a set of barefoot tracks. I told them for the first time about the marked trail, and they said that if there had been anything out there before, it was gone now. Since they'd found tracks, they said they'd leave a patrol car for the night to make sure everything stayed calm, but that it was probably just a homeless person or someone high on something. I had stood face to face with that man, and I couldn't say for sure whether he was homeless or not. His gaze was focused, his movements precise and deliberate, his posture straight, his expression frozen. With the police outside, we were able to relax just a little, but all we could think about was that come morning, they'd be gone, and we had no idea what might happen after that. The man had been very clear in his threat. Around 5 a.m., I heard a noise downstairs. I got up immediately and looked out the window. I wanted to see if the patrol car was still there. Had an officer come into the house? But they didn't have a key and the doors were locked. I heard another sound and knew the man was inside with us. I threw the window open and yelled to the police that he was here. My wife, terrified, jumped up and ran to lock the bedroom door. Downstairs, I could clearly hear someone besides the police, trying to get in. Eventually, one of the windows was broken, and that's how the cops got inside. We didn't open the bedroom door until they knocked and said the house was clear. When we went down the stairs, the bottom part of the house was completely surreal. Some of the furniture had been moved around, and the entryway rug was sitting on top of the couch. 2 picture frames were shattered on the floor, and one of the kitchen knives was embedded in a photo frame on the wall. There were no open windows, no broken doors. But it was clear that man had been inside the house with us. The only explanation I can give is that he has some other way of getting inside, some hidden point of entry we don't know about. But we've searched the entire house, top to bottom, and the police did the same. We haven't found a single thing that could serve as an entry point. The worst part is, I don't think the cops fully believe us. Honestly, if the roles were reversed, I'm not sure I'd believe it either. They don't have a single piece of evidence that anyone else was actually there. Everything points to one of us. Only we know there's someone else. That we're not crazy. That we're being stalked by a man. Nothing that's happened so far makes sense. Least of all, the shirt and the marked trail. They seem like completely disconnected events from everything that followed. And why the hell would that man move our furniture around in the first place? I know he's probably just a madman, and trying to find logic in the actions of a madman is just as insane. But I need to understand what the hell is going on. We're desperate, and we're out of ideas, but we know he's going to come back, and this story is far from over. I don't even know where to start. All I know is that I have to say something, because I can feel myself starting to lose it. And I honestly have no idea what to do about what's been happening to me. I've never been the kind of person who seeks out drama. I'm not exactly a social butterfly either. I've always lived alone, always got along just fine with silence and solitude. I knew from a young age that if I ever managed to buy a house, it would have to be somewhere far away from people, but close to nature. So, when I bought this house up in the Appalachian Mountains, that's exactly why I did it. Peace and quiet. I won't lie, the price was ridiculously tempting too. But what really sold me was the isolation, the distance from cities. The idea of falling asleep to the sound of wind rustling through the trees instead of honking cars or loud neighbors. The house isn't completely isolated. There are a few others scattered around the area. But at night, when I look out the living room window, all I see is a thick, dark wall of forest. It feels like I'm in the middle of nowhere. And at first, that feeling was comforting. Now, I'm not so sure anymore. I moved here with Charlie, my dog, who's been with me for 4 years. He's a lazy old thing, the kind that spends all day curled up napping and grumbles like a cranky old man if you disturb him. He's never been skittish or reactive, never growled or barked without a damn good reason. So when, during the first few days in the house, I noticed him avoiding the back part of the yard, I thought it was odd. I tried to coax him outside, opened the door for him, even nudged him gently with my foot. But he just stood there trembling. Actually trembling. He'd end up backing away and hiding under the kitchen table. I figured maybe it was the unfamiliar forest smells, or the constant buzz of insects, maybe even some animal out there he could sense, but I couldn't. I genuinely thought it was just a phase and that he'd eventually adjust. But days went by, then weeks, and the behavior didn't change. If anything, it got worse. He became more reactive, more visibly scared. He started barking at night, always around 3 or 4 in the morning. But it wasn't normal barking. Not like when a dog hears someone near the house. It was deeper, more urgent, like he was trying to warn something off. One night, I got up and peeked out the bedroom window. The one that faces the woods. It took my eyes a while to adjust to the darkness. But eventually, I could make out a shape. It definitely wasn't a person, that much I was sure of. But I also couldn't tell what kind of animal it might have been. It wasn't moving. Yet it didn't quite look like part of the trees either. I told myself I was probably seeing things, maybe just imagining it. But then, whatever it was, it moved away. And the way it moved really unsettled me. It was far, maybe 50 meters from the house. But the shape was off just enough to make me step back from the window and feel my heart start to pound. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to calm myself down, then told myself it was probably just a deer or some other forest animal. It was dark. I hadn't seen it clearly. There had to be a logical explanation. When I looked down at Charlie, his reaction scared the hell out of me. He was shaking so badly that he'd peed on the floor. I'd never seen him do anything like that before. 2 days later, the atmosphere inside the house had become unbearable. Charlie spent the whole day hiding. And that night I woke up to sounds coming from the roof. It wasn't just footsteps, which would have already been weird enough, but also this constant scraping. Like someone was dragging a rock or maybe metal across the shingles. I crept up to the attic and pressed my ear against the ceiling, trying to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from. But the moment I got up there, everything went silent. And that silence, somehow it was worse than the noise. I've never been the type to scare easily, but this was getting strange, and something inside me told me it wasn't just some random animal. That's when I decided it was time to talk to the neighbors and ask if they knew of any animal that might behave like that. The closest one to me, an older guy, didn't waste time with small talk. He came right out and said these mountains had stories that weren't worth digging into. He told me I should keep my house locked tight, windows shut, and that no matter what happened, I should never open the door at night, even if I heard someone calling me. I asked him why the hell I shouldn't answer if someone was calling for help or something. He just looked at me and said, "There are things in these woods that know how to sound like people." I'd heard stories like that before, sure, but I'd never bought into them. Never believed in any of it. Still, something about the way that man said it planted a seed of doubt in my head. My other neighbor just laughed and said it was all in my imagination. Probably some raccoon or badger with a flair for the dramatic, he joked. And honestly, that explanation made me feel a whole lot better. I went back home thinking maybe I was overreacting. But the next morning, when I went out to grab some firewood, I noticed chunks of roof tiles on the ground. I decided to get up there and see what the hell had done that. I couldn't imagine a raccoon or badger being strong enough to actually break tiles. What I found on the roof freaked me out. Several shingles were scored with deep, parallel lines, like someone or something had dragged enormous claws or a sharp tool across them. It instantly reminded me of that dragging sound I'd heard a few nights before. What kind of animal leaves claw marks like that? Maybe a bear, I thought. But bears leave very distinct marks. I knew enough to know this wasn't a bear. In some areas, the scratches were straight and evenly spaced. In others, they formed a sort of zigzag pattern, strange and unnatural. That night, I heard a whistle coming from the forest. I was in the living room watching a movie when I heard it, sharp and clear. I knew instantly it was coming from the woods. The movie was already paused, and I was sitting there, tense, when the whistle came again. This time, way closer. Charlie started whining like he was in pain. That was it for me. I got up, went to the bedroom, grabbed my gun, and opened the back door. The air outside was bitter cold, colder than I'd expected, and as I walked across the backyard toward the trees, I felt this overwhelming sense of despair settle over me. It's really hard to explain, but that's the best way I can describe it. It was a kind of hopelessness. I didn't see anything, and the whistling had stopped. So I went back inside. Now, I sleep with a rifle under my pillow and a knife in the nightstand drawer. Every night I do 2 rounds of the house to make sure every door and window is locked tight. I don't go out after 6 p.m. Even if it's still light outside, the moment it even starts to get dim, I lock myself in. I don't know what's going on, but I do know something's happening, and I'm not crazy. Something, or someone, is lurking around this house. And Charlie, who's never been afraid of anything, still hides the moment the sun goes down. He growls and barks in the middle of the night like he's trying to protect us from something I can't see. If this keeps up for another week, I'm putting this house on the market. I don't care if I have to move back to the city. Anything's better than living with this constant dread and uncertainty. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
About 7 years ago, I got involved with someone who still makes me question what kind of people are out there. I just come out of an 8-year relationship, and it hit me a lot harder than I expected. Even though we both agreed it wasn't working anymore and ending it was probably the right decision, losing someone who had been part of my everyday life for so long left me feeling completely lost. I didn't really know who I was without that relationship, and it took me a while to even start feeling like myself again. Around that time, I signed up for a dating app. It doesn't really matter which one. I went on a handful of dates with different women, and for the most part, they were all nice people. We got along well enough, but after talking for a while, it usually became obvious that we wanted very different things out of life. I had some enjoyable evenings, but none of those first dates ever turned into a second one. Then I met Polly. There was something about her that immediately pulled me in, and even now I struggle to explain what it was. Looking back, I think part of it was how mysterious she seemed. These days, that's one of the biggest red flags I can think of. I'm not saying I expect someone to tell me their entire life story the first time we meet, because that would be weird. But when someone goes out of their way to hide basic things about themselves, it immediately puts me on edge. That's something I only learned after everything that happened. At the time, though, I thought she was just private. We both lived in West Virginia, and she picked the restaurant for our first date. I actually encouraged her to choose because I know a lot of women feel more comfortable meeting somewhere familiar, somewhere they know they can ask for help if something ever feels off. That made complete sense to me. I still remember the drive there, winding through those quiet Appalachian back roads with almost no traffic around, feeling more nervous than I'd been in years. By the time dinner was over, though, I drove home feeling excited. It had been a long time since I'd met someone who seemed that interesting. After that first date, we spent about a week just texting, because she told me work had gotten really busy. Even though we both lived in West Virginia, we weren't exactly close to each other. So we kept talking every day while trying to figure out when we could meet again. I mention all of this because it's important to understand how things developed before they started getting strange. For the next couple of months, we saw each other pretty regularly. During that time, I kept trying to learn more about her, asking about her family, her friends, where she grew up, the usual things people ask when they're getting to know someone. The problem was that every conversation somehow circled away from her. I never met a single member of her family. I never saw her house. I never met any of her friends. Once she felt comfortable around me, every date happened at my place, with my friends, or somewhere connected to my life. At first, I actually felt guilty for wanting to know more about her, like I was being too pushy. I convinced myself she probably had some difficult family history or something personal she wasn't ready to talk about yet. So, I decided to give her time and let her open up whenever she felt comfortable. Weeks turned into months, but nothing ever changed. One thing she talked about constantly was camping. Even though she'd lived around these mountains her whole life, she claimed she'd never gone hiking or camping before. She seemed fascinated by it. She'd ask to see my gear, wanted me to explain what different pieces of equipment were for, and kept bringing up the idea of us spending a weekend out in the mountains together. I'd camped plenty of times before, so eventually I told her we'd go, if she really wanted to. The very first thing she asked was whether she could choose the exact place where we'd camp. That caught me a little off guard, because she'd never done anything like this before. I couldn't understand how she already had a specific location in mind. She never really explained it. She just said she'd figure something out. I laughed it off and figured it didn't really matter, because I'd scout the area beforehand anyway. That's something I always do. I checked the terrain, nearby campsites, possible hazards, water sources, everything. People who spend enough time in West Virginia usually learn how to prepare before heading into the mountains. Looking back, I walked straight into what she had planned without questioning it nearly enough. The day we finally started hiking, she was more excited than I'd ever seen her. At first I thought it was nice. I figured she was happy to be trying something new with me, and seeing her that excited honestly put me in a great mood too. But after we'd been hiking for a while, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. She kept asking detailed questions about my gear, not in the way someone who's curious normally would, but almost like she was taking inventory of everything I had with me. She seemed especially interested in my satellite phone, since there wouldn't be any cell service where we were going. Then she started asking questions about my handgun. That immediately made me uncomfortable. I'd already told her from the beginning that I never let other people handle it. It wasn't about trust. It was simply something I took very seriously, and I preferred being the only person responsible for it. She didn't like that at all. I could tell it bothered her, and I remember thinking she probably felt like I didn't trust her yet. I tried explaining that it wasn't personal, but after that I couldn't shake the feeling that she was paying a little too much attention to the things I had brought with us. By the end of our first day, we'd reached the area she'd picked. It actually wasn't a bad campsite. It was just farther from everything than I would have chosen myself. We spent the evening like any other camping trip, cooked dinner, talked for a while, and eventually went to sleep. The next morning I realized my satellite phone was gone. What caught my attention even more than the missing phone was the way Polly reacted. She immediately launched into this huge panic, insisting someone must have broken into the tent while we were asleep, stolen it, and disappeared without us noticing. The problem was that none of that made any sense. Before going to bed, after she'd already fallen asleep, I'd locked the tent zipper from the inside with a small padlock, something I always do when camping in remote areas. The zipper had never been opened. There were no cuts in the fabric, no damaged seams, no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. When I pointed that out, and explained that getting into the tent without waking us would have been impossible, I watched her expression change. It wasn't fear anymore. She looked frustrated, almost irritated that I'd shut down her explanation so quickly. At that point, I asked to look through her backpack. She completely lost it. She exploded at me for even suggesting she had anything to do with it, acting in a way I'd never seen before, and I'll admit, it caught me completely off guard. I backed away, told her we were leaving immediately, and started packing my gear. By then, I was convinced she'd taken the satellite phone herself. There simply wasn't another explanation. Nobody else had been inside that tent. She was the only other person there. That's when she told me she didn't care if I left, because she was staying. Even after everything that had happened, I still couldn't bring myself to leave her alone in the middle of those mountains. I tried to reason with her one last time. I told her the woods weren't the kind of place to play games, that I understood she was upset, even if I couldn't understand why, and that I didn't care who was right anymore. I just wanted both of us out of there before something bad happened. I explained that there were predators out there, that those mountains could turn dangerous fast if you didn't know what you were doing, and that if she came back with me, she'd never have to see or talk to me again. I wasn't trying to save the relationship. I was trying to get us both out of a dangerous situation alive. She was furious, way beyond what made any sense. It wasn't normal anger anymore. She refused to leave, told me she was staying no matter what, and insisted that if I was leaving, I should leave most of my gear behind so she'd at least have what she needed to sleep comfortably. At that point, I'd run out of ways to convince her. I figured we were both adults. If she wanted to stay, that was her choice. I knew I was only about a day's hike from my truck, and if I kept moving that night, I could probably make it back. All I wanted was to get away from whatever this had turned into. Before I left, though, she demanded that I hand over my gun. That was the one thing I wasn't even willing to consider. I told her it wasn't happening. If she wanted to hike out with me, she was welcome to come, but if she insisted on staying, she'd have to make do with the supplies I was already leaving behind. I wasn't giving her my firearm under any circumstances. She completely lost it after that. She was practically screaming at me, acting in a way that honestly scared me more than anything that had happened up to that point. I started wondering if she might actually try to hurt me herself, so I stopped arguing. I picked up my pack, turned around, and started following the trail back toward where I knew my truck was parked. I couldn't have been more than 30 minutes away when I climbed onto a rocky overlook to catch my breath. From there, I had a clear view of the area we'd camped in, and I noticed what looked like our tent off to my right. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw 3 men walking toward her. My stomach tightened immediately. Those mountains attract all kinds of people, and not all of them are there for good reasons, so my first thought was that she was about to get herself into trouble. Then I watched her greet them. She walked right up to them and hugged them. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look, and that's when everything clicked into place. All 3 of them were armed. They looked rough, like they spent a lot of time out there, and the 4 of them immediately started talking in a way that looked frantic. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I was, but I didn't need to. Every instinct I had told me they were talking about me. Whatever this trip had been, it hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned. I didn't waste another second trying to figure it out. I slipped back behind the rocks, left the trail she knew I'd take, and cut across to a creek I remembered seeing on my map. Once I reached the water, I started following it upstream as fast as I could. I wanted to leave as little of a trail behind as possible. I ran until my legs felt like they were going to give out, putting as much distance between me and that campsite as I could. When night finally caught up with me, I found a spot where I could shelter with solid cover and a clear view of anyone approaching. If somebody came looking for me, I'd see them before they saw me. As you can probably imagine, I didn't sleep for even a minute. I just sat there with my gun in my hands, listening to every sound in the woods until the sun finally came up. The second it was light enough to move safely, I got back on my feet and kept hiking until I reached my truck. I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. For a while afterward, I was nervous because she knew where I lived. I'd brought her to my place plenty of times. The only thing that gave me some peace of mind was that I shared the house with 2 other guys, and none of us were exactly small. If she or those men ever decided to show up, they wouldn't be dealing with just one person. Luckily, the timing worked in my favor. The 3 of us were already in the process of moving because our landlord had raised the rent and we weren't willing to pay it. She knew I was leaving that house, but she never found out where I moved. That was 7 years ago. I've never seen her again, never heard from her again, and I've spent a lot of time wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed. I'm convinced the whole thing was a setup from the very beginning. I don't know exactly what they planned to do, or why she lied about never having been in those mountains before, when those guys walked straight to her like they'd done it 100 times. I know she took my satellite phone. I'm almost certain the next step would have been getting my gun away from me too. The only reason she never did was because I always slept with it against my body, and she probably realized she couldn't take it without waking me up. I don't know what would have happened to me if I'd stayed there one more hour, but I'm convinced it would have been something very, very bad. What I'm about to tell you happened about a year ago in the Appalachian Mountains. The worst part of it didn't actually happen to me, though. It happened to someone I was lucky enough to help, and looking back, I think we both came within minutes of something much worse. I've replayed that night in my head more times than I can count, wondering how differently it could have ended if I'd made even one different decision. I've always been into hiking and camping. For years, my favorite place was the Pacific Crest Trail. But then the Appalachians started getting a lot more attention online. People couldn't seem to agree on whether they were beautiful or terrifying, and that only made me more curious. I started exploring different sections whenever I had time, and I fell in love with the place after my very first trip. I still go back every year. What happened that night didn't scare me away from those mountains. but it definitely changed how I camp. I'm a lot more cautious now, and I pay attention to things I probably would have ignored before. It happened on the very first night of that trip. I was camping in a part of West Virginia where almost nobody goes anymore. There's an old dirt road that still leads into the area, but it's in terrible shape, and most vehicles wouldn't even make it through. One section farther up had even been closed off years earlier because it was considered unsafe. So the whole place stays incredibly quiet. I'd camped there twice before without a single problem. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was already dark. I had my Jeep parked where I wanted it, both tents were up, and dinner was cooking over my stove. I've had a habit for years of setting up what I call a decoy tent. One tent sits out in the open with some gear and supplies inside, while the one I actually sleep in is tucked away somewhere harder to spot. It's something I started doing after a few uncomfortable encounters with weird people over the years. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to convince me that having a backup plan isn't a bad idea. While I was eating, I happened to look across the valley toward the ridge on the opposite side. That's when I noticed a flashlight moving around. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike at odd hours sometimes, and I figured somebody was making their way to a campsite. But I kept watching for a few minutes because something about the way the light moved felt off. Then another light appeared much farther down the mountain. When I say farther, I mean they were nowhere near each other. It definitely wasn't two people hiking together. As I watched, a pattern became obvious. The first light was steadily moving toward the second one. The second light kept turning on and off, over and over again, while continuing to move away. It looked less like someone hiking, and more like someone trying to see where they were going without making themselves too easy to track. That was the first moment I started thinking I might be watching someone chase another person through the woods. Situations like that always put me in a difficult spot. Part of me wants to mind my own business, especially when I'm alone in the middle of nowhere. The other part can't just ignore something that looks wrong. I'd run into enough strange situations over the years to know that people can be every bit as dangerous as the wildlife out there. I kept watching, hoping I'd realize there was a harmless explanation for what I was seeing. Then the two lights got much closer together, and I heard a scream echo across the valley. It was unmistakably a woman's voice, and it wasn't the kind of scream you mistake for someone joking around. It was the sound of somebody desperately trying to get anyone nearby to realize they were in serious trouble. I figured I was at least 40 minutes away on foot, so I made a split-second decision. I grabbed my handgun, threw a few essentials into my Jeep, started the engine, and headed down the dirt road toward where I'd seen the lights. At first I drove with my headlights on, moving as fast as the road would let me, which honestly wasn't very fast because the trail was rough enough to shake the whole vehicle apart. Once I got close to where I thought everything had happened, I switched the headlights off and crept forward as quietly as I could. Eventually, I stopped completely, shut the engine off, cracked the driver's door open, and just listened. For several minutes, I didn't hear anything except the woods around me, Then I picked up the faint sound of someone crying. It was quiet, almost impossible to hear, but it was close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I quietly closed the door, started walking toward the sound, and within maybe 5 minutes I saw them. A man was standing over someone lying on the ground, hitting them over and over again. Seeing something like that flipped a switch in me. I've never been able to stand by and watch somebody get hurt without doing something. I yelled as loud as I could to get his attention, raised my handgun, and fired. I'd been shooting for years, mostly clay targets, and I knew exactly where I wanted that shot to land. I hit his hand hard enough to make him stop what he was doing without risking the woman on the ground. Everything after that happened so fast, it's still hard to remember every detail. The woman started screaming, completely terrified because she had no idea what had just happened. The man yelled too, spun around toward me, and for the first time, I got a decent look at him. Even in the dark, I could tell he was a large, white man with a beard. Before I could react again, he turned and disappeared into the trees at a full sprint. For a couple of seconds, I seriously considered chasing him. I knew he'd been hit, and I figured he couldn't have gotten very far. But the woman needed help a lot more than I needed to catch him. I ran over to her, helped her to her feet, and got her back to my Jeep. She was in terrible shape. I won't go into detail because nobody needs that picture in their head, but it was obvious she'd been through something horrific. I gave her some water, found a little food she could manage, and waited until she was calm enough to tell me what had happened. She looked young, probably in her early 20s, and she could barely get the words out. Between sobs, she explained that she'd been hiking with a friend when they'd crossed paths with that man. Her friend had managed to escape, but she'd been caught. She'd gotten away once after that, but he'd tracked her down again, and she'd been trying to stay alive in those mountains for almost 3 days. I didn't waste another second and drove straight to the nearest hospital. I stayed at the hospital long enough for the police to arrive so I could give my statement. Once they got there, I could see she was in good hands, both with the hospital staff and with the officers handling the case. From what they told me, this wasn't the first report they'd received about someone stalking people in that particular area. Apparently, there had already been an investigation going on for a while, but they still hadn't found anything concrete. They told me that if the case moved forward, they'd get back in touch and ask me to see if I could identify the man. I explained that I probably wouldn't be much help. I never got a clear look at his face. All I could tell them was that he was a tall white man with a beard and a fairly large build. Beyond that, it had simply been too dark for me to make out any real details. The young woman, though, despite everything she'd been through, struck me as incredibly resilient. She seemed much more likely to be able to give them a detailed description of the man who'd been chasing her. She thanked me over and over again, even though I didn't feel like I'd done anything that deserved thanking. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I did what I hope anyone else would have done. After about 3 hours of answering questions, giving my statement, and leaving all of my contact information, I finally headed home. I never heard another word about the case. I never found out what happened to her, or whether her friend was ever found. The police never called me back, and I never received any kind of update. I still think about both of them every now and then, and I hope they're both alive, safe, and doing well. I've had my share of strange experiences over the years, especially out in the mountains, but this one has stayed with me more than any of the others. It wasn't because I fired my gun, or because I came face to face with someone capable of doing something so violent. It was because of the condition that young woman was in when I found her, and because I still can't shake the feeling that if I'd looked away from those lights across the valley, or convinced myself it was none of my business, she probably wouldn't be here today.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're heading back out to the Appalachian Mountains to dive into two of the wildest stories I've come across lately. Full of creepy legends, strange disappearances, and weird lights in the woods. It's a place that practically breathes mystery and fear. And these two stories, they fit that reputation perfectly. The first one happened over 30 years ago, but it hits like it happened yesterday, and nothing about it has changed since. The second is just plain bizarre and seriously disturbing. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. It's been over 34 years since that trip. And to this day, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'm being chased all over again. It doesn't happen as often as it did when I was younger. Over the years, I've learned to cope better. But I think the fact that I was so young when it all happened left a deeper mark. It was the summer of 1991. I was just 13 years old back then. And if I'm being honest, that summer was supposed to be the last one we'd all spend together. My dad, my mom, my older sister Rachel, and me. My sister was planning to move to Europe. And even though neither mom nor dad wanted to admit it, we all knew she was probably gonna stay there. So this was our last chance to be together as a family, at least for a couple of years. I remember how excited we were about heading down to the Appalachian Trail for a week of camping and hiking. Even my mom, who was never much of a fan of mountain trips, was excited. My dad had planned everything for months. He said we'd disconnect from the world, just be a family in nature, no distractions. We left early on a Saturday morning, everything packed tight in Dad's old Ford Explorer. The kind that always smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and his cologne. A smell that never quite went away. I remember the feeling of the mountain air hitting my face as we drove deeper into the Appalachians. The trees getting thicker, the road narrower. I remember thinking that the scenery was as beautiful as it was completely terrifying. The first couple of days went just as Dad had hoped. We hiked long trails, set up camp near a creek, told stories by the fire while eating burnt marshmallows, and listened to the sounds of the forest at night. The biggest miracle of all was that my sister and my dad actually went 3 whole days without fighting. So everything was going even better than any of us had expected. I was always a little jumpy in the dark, especially when my sister purposely told scary stories just to freak me out. But Dad would always laugh it off, saying, "Critters out here are more afraid of you than you are of them, most of the time anyway." It was the fourth day when things started to feel a little off. We'd hiked farther than we had the previous days. I remember my mom being a bit worried that it might be too much for me, but I was eager to prove I could handle it. So even though I was tired, I kept pretending I was excited to keep going. We passed an old, rusted-out pickup truck just off to the side in the woods, far from the trail, half covered in brush and vines. It looked like it had been sitting there for years, but the door had clearly been opened recently. The ground around it was clear. My dad stopped and stared at it for a moment, like something about it didn't sit right. We all walked closer to the truck, and I saw Mom and Dad exchange a look. Then my sister said that someone had definitely been sleeping inside. You could see a bunch of personal stuff in the cab, and even though it was dirty, it all looked kind of recent. As my dad inspected it more closely, I caught sight of what looked like someone watching us from the bushes. I was just about to say something when my sister looked at me and said, I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. I really didn't want to seem like a scared kid. They'd probably think I was making it up, so I kept that to myself. Dad eventually said not to worry. It was probably someone's old hunting truck from years ago. Then he walked away from the truck, and we moved on. That night, we made camp in a clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It took hours to find that spot and set up our tent. We'd walked a long way from where we saw that pickup, and at some point, I'd overheard my mom telling my dad she wanted to set up camp as far away from that truck as possible, just to be safe. Then we did exactly what we'd done the nights before. Started a small fire, cooked some food, and sat around talking. I thought again about telling them what I'd seen near the truck, but once again, I kept it to myself. Somewhere around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves. My first thought was that it might be a bear or something like that. But then I realized they were footsteps. Human footsteps. Not like an animal rustling, but heavy, deliberate steps. I thought maybe it was one of my parents. But their tent made a loud noise when you opened it, and I definitely would have heard that. I was stone still, like my body just shut off. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and steady, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I remember peeking out through the flap of the tent, and in the dim moonlight, I could just barely make out a figure standing beyond the tree line. They weren't moving. Just standing there, watching. I covered my mouth with both hands to keep from screaming and grabbed my sister's leg. She let out a small sound in surprise. Whoever was out there must have heard it, because when I looked back, the figure was gone. I told my sister what I'd seen, that someone was out there, and that I had already seen someone watching us earlier by the pickup truck. She believed me instantly. I don't know if it was the panic on my face or the sound of my voice. But something made her realize I was serious. She signaled me to stay quiet and not leave the tent, then ran to wake up our parents. She told Dad someone was out there. He grabbed his flashlight and did a sweep, even called out. But nothing. No footprints, no sounds, no sign of anyone. He told me it was probably just a deer, or maybe I'd had a nightmare. But neither my sister nor I slept the rest of that night. I knew what I'd seen, and my sister had always had this freaky sixth sense. She knew something wasn't right. The next morning, we found the strings holding our food bags had been cut. Not chewed. Cut clean, like with a knife or something sharp. Some of our packs had been moved too. Nothing stolen, just messed with and rearranged. That was the first time I saw my dad genuinely worried. He didn't say it out loud, but it was all over his face. He asked me exactly what I had seen, where I had seen it. When I told him about the man near the truck, he looked truly concerned. My mom put a hand over her mouth and my sister said we should leave. We didn't know what that person wanted, and maybe they weren't dangerous, but it wasn't worth the risk. We packed up quickly and started hiking back toward where we had parked the car, even though we were supposed to stay 2 more nights. The weird thing was, we couldn't seem to find the same trail back. We followed the same markers. Dad was sure of it. But nothing looked familiar. The forest felt different. We were all clearly shaken, and stress can mess with your sense of direction. But then my sister saw something that scared the hell out of us. One of the trail markers looked faint, like someone had scraped it recently. A little farther along, we touched another sign, and Mom confirmed what she feared. Someone had tampered with the trail markers. They had erased one and painted another to lead us in a totally different direction. That night, we didn't even set up camp properly. We just threw down sleeping bags and kept the fire burning. Dad stayed up, holding the hatchet in one hand and his flashlight in the other. Around midnight, we heard it again. Footsteps circling us in the dark. And then laughter. Dad jumped up immediately, gun in hand, and fired into the air. But the laughter didn't stop. Whoever was out there in the darkness wasn't scared. I felt something wet on my hand and realized I was crying from sheer fear. My sister, who had her hands over her ears, pulled me close. My mom stood up too and grabbed the other gun, positioning herself on the opposite side of Dad, both of them forming a kind of shield around us. By this point, the laughter had stopped and silence took over. Complete, heavy silence. At first light the next morning we ran. We didn't even eat. We just picked a direction and started moving. We stopped following trail signs and just walked in the direction the compass pointed, not even sure we were heading the right way. We just wanted to get the hell out of that nightmare. But not even 3 minutes later, we stumbled onto something straight out of a horror movie. A completely destroyed campsite. Dried blood everywhere. Or at least what looked like blood. My mom immediately covered my eyes, but I had already seen. On the ground was a stuffed koala, torn to shreds. Outside one of the tents, a bloodied rock tied to a rope. No one said it, but we all knew. That rock had been used as a weapon and left there on purpose. But there was no one around. My dad stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. And then we heard it again. The laughter. This time, farther away, but still too close. Whoever was out there had seen us, and they knew we were at that ruined campsite. My dad kept spinning around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but it felt like it was coming from every direction. It was my mom who finally snapped us out of it. She grabbed all of us and made us keep moving. Hours later, we stumbled onto an old ranger station, boarded up and abandoned. But inside, carved into a wooden wall, was a map that helped Dad figure out roughly where we were. There was a radio too, but the line had been cut. Still no cell signal. We had no idea exactly where we were, but at least we had shelter. This time, my mom took the first watch, but we didn't even get a chance to fall asleep before we heard it again. Laughter, just outside the shelter. My dad was losing it, seriously thinking about going out there and firing in every direction, but my mom stopped him. She told him we'd survive by staying together and trying to get out at first light. All through the night we heard the laughter, off and on, sometimes followed by a scraping sound against the wood. We didn't know what it was, but we found out in the morning. The entire outer wall of the shelter had been scratched up. Some areas had strange, unrecognizable symbols carved into them, clearly scratched in, probably with a knife. That day, we just kept running, sunburnt, dehydrated, and scared out of our minds. Eventually, we made it to a small village where we got a ride to the nearest police station. My dad reported everything to the local authorities, but they didn't take it seriously. It was over 25 years ago. The resources were more limited, and no one really seemed to care. They said maybe we ran into a hunter or a squatter, but there were no cabins in that area, no signs of anyone living nearby. My dad got so angry they almost arrested him. My mom had to calm him down and said the best thing we could do was get out of there. A few months later, my sister moved to Europe. My dad became obsessed with police reports and spent years combing through newspapers and other sources, looking for a missing family in that region. But the problem was, we didn't even know exactly where we had been. The forest was massive, and we had covered an equally massive area. My mom tried to block it all out. She banned my dad from talking about it around her. In a way, I followed in her footsteps. I watched my dad slowly get consumed by the mystery, but only as a bystander. I never acted on it, until now. It's been 2 years since it happened, and still, there are moments, small, unexpected ones, that bring it all rushing back like it just happened yesterday. Not in dramatic flashes, but in subtle, unsettling ways. Like when I catch the scent of damp soil mixed with wood smoke, drifting in from someone's backyard fire pit. Or when the wind rustles through the trees late at night, just outside my bedroom window, in that same slow, dragging way it did back in those hills. That's when I feel it. The weight in my chest, the tension in my shoulders. Like my body recognizes something my brain keeps trying to forget. It was the summer of 2023. I had just turned 27, and my best friend Nate was finishing up a long, brutal breakup. We were both looking for a way to disconnect from everything. No phones, no news, no drama. Just a week off the grid, hiking and camping in the wild. So when Nate suggested we take a summer trip down to West Virginia, I was all in. We'd done smaller hikes before, weekend stuff mostly, but nothing like this. We spent a few weeks prepping, checking gear, mapping out a route that would take us about 5 days in and out, with stops at various backcountry sites. Nate borrowed a satellite phone from his brother just in case. We left on a Tuesday morning, late June. The heat was already pushing up past 90 by the time we got to the trailhead. I remember how the humidity hit like a wall as soon as we stepped out of the truck, and how the trees swallowed the sound of the road behind us the deeper we went. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it's an absolutely perfect feeling. As you move deeper into the trees and they begin to absorb the sounds of cars and the city, it's like everything you're leaving behind slowly starts to dissolve. It makes you feel more present, more aware of the moment you're in. The first day went smoothly. We hiked around 10 miles, found a nice spot beside a small river, and set up camp. We ate those vacuum-sealed camping meals that taste like warm cardboard, shared a couple of beers we'd kept cold in the truck's cooler, and sat under the stars, talking about life. It was good, and we were laughing. The next morning, we broke camp early and kept moving. The forest in that part of West Virginia is dense. Real old-growth trees, moss climbing up the trunks, light barely filtering through the canopy. Around midday, we passed a couple of other hikers going the opposite direction. An older guy and his daughter, I think. We exchanged some small talk and they warned us about bears, told us they'd seen fresh scat just a few miles up. Nate joked that he hoped the bears were vegan. I laughed, but I remember the dad didn't. He just gave us a strange look and said, "Be careful out there. There's a lot more than bears in these woods." Then they kept walking. At the time, I brushed it off as backwoods eccentricity. You know, locals trying to spook outsiders. But now, I'm not so sure. He was clearly trying to warn us, but something was stopping him from being completely direct. That evening, after another long day of hiking, we found a spot to set up camp again. It was a clearing near a ridge, good visibility, decent cover from wind. As we were setting up the tent, Nate found something odd just a little ways off. A pile of rocks, maybe 2 feet high, and sticking out of the middle of it was a deer skull. Just sitting there, clean, bleached by sun and time. There were no other bones, just the skull. He joked it was probably some kind of Appalachian Blair Witch thing, but I could tell it unsettled him too. We moved a little farther down before settling in. We're from a part of the country where cults aren't exactly rare, and a few years ago, his sister ended up caught in the middle of one. Things almost went really bad, but she got out just in time. So I know he said it like a joke, like he was just messing around, but I could tell. His body was tense, his eyes more focused. Deep down, he wasn't laughing. He was clearly tense. So I suggested we go for a short walk. Nothing major. We weren't going to stray far from where we were camped. Just move around a bit to clear our heads. He agreed, and we headed in the direction we'd be hiking the next day. The opposite direction of where we'd found those stones and that skull. We hadn't been walking for more than 5 minutes when we suddenly came across a decapitated opossum. At first, we didn't think much of it. Predators are common in the woods. Maybe a bear, like the man had warned us about, had gotten to it. But as I stepped closer, I realized the head hadn't been torn off. It had been cut. The body was untouched, and the wound was too clean. A blade had done that. Nate came to the same conclusion I did. Someone had done this. The thought sent a chill down my spine. It was grotesque. I've always felt deeply unsettled by people who hurt animals for no reason. It doesn't just make me uncomfortable. It genuinely makes me sad. Like it drains your faith in people. I tried to push that feeling down. Told Nate the best thing we could do was head back to camp, take turns sleeping, and leave that area as soon as possible. Not because we thought something would happen, but because the idea of camping between a macabre altar with a skull on one side and a headless opossum on the other, it just felt wrong, off, and unsafe. So that's what we did. We took turns sleeping through the night, one of us always keeping watch. At one point, somewhere around 3 a.m., I thought I heard leaves rustling nearby. It sounded like an animal moving around, so I stayed still and just listened. But nothing else happened. In the morning, as we packed up and made our way back toward the trail, we saw something I still have a hard time describing. We got to the spot where we'd seen the opossum, but now the head was back on the body. Only it wasn't natural. The head had been stitched back on, with what looked like some disgusting, rotting fabric or string. Something improvised and filthy. It was a sickening sight. So messed up that I had to fight the urge to vomit right there. And that's when it hit me. Those noises I'd heard during the night, that wasn't an animal. That was a person. A psychopath doing that. Whatever that was. We both agreed we had to leave immediately. The idea of being within a few miles of someone capable of doing that made my skin crawl. Who the hell does something like that? We started walking as fast as we could. We weren't admiring the trees anymore. We weren't stopping to catch our breath. We didn't even talk. The entire area had lost any beauty it once had. It was poisoned by whatever we had stumbled into. We knew there was a junction point a few miles ahead where we could reconnect with one of the main trails. As soon as we reached the main trail, we knew it would be easier to either backtrack or find an exit point from the forest where we could hitch a ride back to where the car was parked. So we just kept walking. The problem was, by nightfall, we still hadn't made it to the trail. We had to stop. Neither of us wanted to hike through the woods in the dark. The plan stayed the same. Take turns sleeping, and as soon as the sun came up, keep moving. I was the first to sleep, but around 3 a.m., Nate shook me awake in a full-blown panic, saying there was someone in the trees. I barely had time to process what he was saying before he shoved a knife into my hand. He had my gun. As my eyes adjusted and I sat up, I realized just how dark the forest was. The moonlight barely made it through the canopy. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Nate was right. We weren't alone out there. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my arm. A man, filthy, disgusting, appeared right in front of me. I didn't even have time to react. Nate swung his hiking stick with everything he had and cracked the guy across the head. The man stumbled and collapsed to the ground. He was horrifying. I've never seen anything like it. He barely looked human. There was something off, something animalistic about him. I don't even know how to explain it better than that, but that was exactly what it felt like. Like I was looking at something stuck between a man and a beast. And then it all exploded. 2 more men came charging out of the trees, just like the first one. Nate didn't hesitate. He fired the gun at them. And we ran. No looking back, no checking if they were hit. We just ran. We left everything behind, except what we had on us, and sprinted through the forest until our lungs were burning. When we finally stopped, we thought we had put some real distance between us and them. We were in a low part of the terrain, and that's when we saw them again. Standing above us on a ridge, silhouetted by the moonlight. And if I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. None of them moved like normal people. They all had 2 legs, but it was like their bones were broken, like their knees bent the wrong way. Their movement was jerky, unnatural. I looked over at Nate, who was staring at them just like I was, and he whispered, "What the fuck are those things?" We kept running. We didn't know if they could move faster than us or not. We were completely desperate. That's when Nate pulled out the satellite phone and called the police. I could hear the panic in his voice, the gasping from running, the raw fear. He explained where we were heading, and told them we needed someone to meet us at the trail junction. I honestly didn't think we were going to make it. The faster we ran, the more I felt like they were getting closer. We were both exhausted, dehydrated, completely wrecked. I always thought I'd be the type of person who could stay calm in a situation like that. But the truth is, you don't know how you'll react until you live it. Around 8:30 that morning, we reached the meeting point, and thank God, they were there. A full search team was waiting. They hadn't ignored the call. They had really come. I can't even describe the relief I felt. Nate broke down crying, out of stress, out of fear, out of everything he'd been holding in. I'd never seen him cry before. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. My legs were shaking. My chest was still tight. But I was alive. And I was safe. They took us to the hospital and ran a drug test on both of us. Of course they did. I don't blame them. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were either insane or high out of their mind. But the tests came back clean. That's when the cops launched a full manhunt. Apparently, 5 people had gone missing in that area over the past few months, and there was already an open investigation. Our account just confirmed that something seriously wrong was happening out there. A few days later, they told us they found an altar, just like the one we described, but miles away from the one we'd originally seen. And now, 2 more people are missing. A couple. To this day, the police still have no answers, no suspects, no real explanation for what we saw. But I know what I saw. And I know we weren't supposed to leave those woods alive. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've never told this story publicly before, and for years I convinced myself there was no point in bringing it up. It happened in November of 2015, during a short stay at a historic hotel in West Virginia, and for a long time, I treated it like one of those strange memories that gets filed away because it makes less sense the more you examine it. The reason I'm talking about it now is because a few weeks ago, I came across a YouTube video about that same hotel. A paranormal investigation channel had gone there after hearing stories about unexplained activity, and while they didn't capture anything dramatic, just hearing the name and seeing the building again brought the entire experience back to the surface. I realized I'd never actually stopped thinking about it. I'd just gotten very good at pretending it had been a dream. Back then, my wife and I had planned a longer vacation, but she was still finishing a renovation project at home. She works in interior design, and our house had been filled with contractors, tools, dust, and constant noise for weeks. I still had work to finish before we could leave, and instead of trying to focus in the middle of all that chaos, I booked myself 3 nights at this old mountain hotel. The idea was simple. I'd get my emails and reports done in peace. She'd join me after the renovations were wrapped up, and then we'd continue on to our actual vacation destination together. In my mind, those first few days were supposed to feel like a quiet little retreat. I'd work during the day, relax at night, and enjoy being somewhere peaceful before the real trip began. The hotel itself was beautiful in that old Appalachian way. It had dark wood walls, exposed beams, stone fireplaces, and the kind of creaking floors that made it feel like the building had been standing there for generations. It was clearly historic, but it was also comfortable and well-maintained. My room was on the 4th floor, near the end of a hallway that felt unusually quiet from the moment I arrived. I checked in during the afternoon, carried my bags upstairs, and settled into a room that overlooked the mountains. By that evening, I had finished most of my work and was finally starting to relax. I sent my last few scheduled emails, made myself some coffee, and settled into bed with my laptop to watch a movie. Sometime after midnight, I started hearing voices through the wall beside my bed. At first, I assumed it was just another guest talking too loudly. Hotels can be noisy, and older buildings don't always have the best soundproofing. But within a minute or two, it became obvious that this wasn't casual conversation. 2 men were arguing. One voice sounded sharp and aggressive, while the other sounded strained, nervous, and increasingly frightened. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I could hear the tone clearly enough to know that something was wrong. Every so often, there was a dull thud against the wall, not loud enough to sound like furniture being thrown, but deliberate enough to make me sit up and listen. I tried to ignore it at first. I remember telling myself I'd give it another minute, and if it kept escalating, I'd either knock on the door or call the front desk. The argument continued, and the frightened voice sounded more desperate. Finally, I got up, walked into the hallway, and knocked on the neighboring room's door. I knocked once, then again, then a 3rd time, and the voices stopped immediately. I waited there for several seconds, expecting someone to answer, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no apology, and no movement inside. I called through the door that I was going to speak to the front desk because I was trying to sleep and the noise was getting out of hand. But still, there was nothing. I went downstairs expecting the receptionist to apologize and maybe send security upstairs. Instead, when I explained that there had been a loud argument in the room next to mine, she looked genuinely confused. She asked which room I was in, and when I told her, she said that the room beside mine was vacant. I assumed she meant the guests had checked out earlier, but then she added that there was actually no one staying on my floor at all. The hotel had very low occupancy that week, and the only other guests were 4 people staying in the suites on the floor above. She hesitated for a moment, then said she would go upstairs and check anyway. I followed her back to the 4th floor, feeling embarrassed and slightly irritated. I kept thinking maybe 2 staff members had used the room temporarily, or maybe there had been some kind of mix-up with housekeeping. But when she unlocked the room beside mine, it was completely empty. The bed was made, the lights were off, and there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. She apologized, suggested I might have heard noise from another part of the hotel, and went back downstairs. I returned to my room feeling unsettled, but I eventually convinced myself that the old building had strange acoustics and that I'd probably overreacted. The next night, the exact same thing happened. I finished my work earlier, watched another movie, and was just starting to relax when the voices began again through the wall. This time, there was no mistaking it. The same 2 men were arguing. One voice was angry and forceful, while the other sounded frightened and defensive. The thudding against the wall came back too, sharper now, as if someone was being shoved into it. I sat there frozen for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to call the front desk immediately. And then there was one violent crash that sounded like a body hitting the wall hard enough to shake the room. I remembered that the rooms had connected balconies, separated by a wooden divider that didn't completely block the view. My first thought was that if I stepped outside quietly, I might be able to identify the men arguing and give the front desk a clearer description. I opened my balcony door and moved carefully toward the divider. The mountain air was cold, and the hotel grounds below were almost completely dark. I leaned just far enough to look into the neighboring balcony area, and what I saw made every rational thought leave my mind at once. A man was lying on the floor, stretched out on his back. Another man was kneeling over him, with one hand pressed against his chest, and the other holding what looked unmistakably like a knife. There was blood beneath the man on the floor, dark and spreading across the wooden boards. The attacker's posture was tense and violent, as if the struggle had only just ended. I ducked back instantly, my heart slamming against my ribs, and for a second I could barely breathe. I knew with absolute certainty that I had just witnessed a murder. I ran downstairs to the front desk and told the receptionist she needed to call the police immediately. I explained that there was a man with a knife on the balcony beside my room and another man bleeding on the floor. She went pale and said that the room had been empty the previous night when she checked it. Even so, She picked up the phone and called for help while the hotel security guard came over. The three of us went back upstairs together, and I was shaking so badly by then that I could barely explain what I'd seen. The security guard unlocked the neighboring room and entered first. I followed close behind, expecting to see blood, broken furniture, and two men. Instead, the room was spotless. The bed was made, the curtains were still, and the room was completely empty. There was no blood, no knife, no sign of a struggle, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. I remember insisting that I had seen it clearly, that I wasn't drunk, medicated, or hallucinating, and that I had no history of seeing things. The receptionist and the guard searched the room carefully, but they found nothing. They both asked me several times if I was okay and whether there was anyone they could call for me. As a last resort, they even said they could have a staff member drive me to the hospital. I looked at both of them and could clearly see the expressions of sympathy and confusion on their faces. They either thought I'd lost my mind or that I was under the influence of something. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay there. I went back downstairs, too unsettled to return to my room, and sat near the lobby fireplace. An older maintenance worker was cleaning near the chimney, and after a while, he noticed how shaken I was. He asked what had happened, and I ended up telling him the whole story. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach drop. He said the hotel dated back to the early 19th century and had seen several violent incidents over the years. According to him, 5 of the 9 recorded crimes connected to the hotel had happened in that specific room, and guests had reported strange activity there for decades. I didn't know what to say. I've never been someone who automatically believes in ghosts or hauntings, and even then I kept trying to find a rational explanation. But I also knew what I had seen. I checked out that same night and drove to another hotel farther down the mountain. When I told my wife what had happened, she listened quietly and said she thought I might have witnessed something residual. 2 people trapped in the same violent moment over and over again. I dismissed the idea at first, but later, when I replayed the scene in my head, I realized something I hadn't noticed in the moment. The men's clothes hadn't looked modern. The man with the knife had been wearing dark trousers and a white shirt that looked older than contemporary business attire. And the man on the floor had been dressed in a way that didn't quite fit 2015 either. At the time, the violence of the scene had overwhelmed everything else. For years, I tried to forget about it. I never contacted the hotel again, and I never even drove anywhere near it again. But when that YouTube investigation appeared recently, I watched the entire video with my pulse racing. They walked through the same hallways, stood outside the same room, and talked about the hotel's history. They didn't capture anything unusual, at least not on camera, but I sat there feeling the same cold fear I had felt that night. I still don't know what happened. Maybe exhaustion, stress, and an old hotel played tricks on my mind. Maybe I witnessed something I can't explain. All I know is that I saw 2 men on that room, one of them bleeding and the other holding a knife. And when I went back with help, there was nothing there at all. This all happened when I was 14 years old, back when I was doing things that were obviously illegal. So, don't take this as advice. I'm an adult now, and I've had plenty of time to realize just how reckless I was. But to understand why I ended up in that situation, you need a little background. I grew up in the mountains and forests of West Virginia, and I never had the kind of family that taught me right from wrong. Nobody sat me down and explained what I should or shouldn't do. I was basically raised on my own. My parents never really wanted me. I wasn't a planned pregnancy, and my dad spent most of my childhood making my mom's life miserable. Our house was completely dysfunctional, and from a very young age, the only way I knew how to deal with everything was by leaving. I'd disappear into the mountains and spend entire days wandering through the woods. Before I was even a teenager, I'd learned how to recognize dangerous situations, avoid predators, and survive out there well enough that the mountains started feeling more like home than the place I actually lived. Whenever I had the chance, that's where I wanted to be. The town I grew up in was a little unusual for that part of Appalachia. Most of the region was struggling financially when I was a kid, but our town had a factory that had made a handful of families pretty wealthy. Because of that, I went to school with kids whose lives looked nothing like mine. Every year they'd come back from summer break talking about vacations in Florida, Europe, or places I'd only ever seen on TV. Meanwhile, I'd spent the whole summer trying not to be at home. After a while, I got tired of feeling embarrassed whenever people asked what I'd done over the break. So I started lying. I'd tell everyone I was going on vacation too. The difference was that my vacations weren't booked by my parents. I'd simply leave the house for a week or two, and nobody even seemed to notice I was gone. My parents barely paid attention to whether I was home in the first place. I'd hitch rides whenever I could, hop freight trains when I couldn't, sleep in the woods, abandoned cabins, or anywhere I could find shelter, and somehow always managed to make it back before school started. Looking back, it's a miracle nothing happened to me sooner. This story happened during one of those trips, when I was 14. I was heading toward North Carolina and had decided to hop onto a regional freight train that crossed part of the Appalachian Mountains. It was an area I'd never explored before, and I was excited to see it. My plan was simple. If I found somewhere interesting along the way, I'd get off, camp in the woods for a few days, and maybe even spend a night or two in one of the abandoned cabins scattered throughout the mountains. If nothing caught my attention, I'd stay on the train until it reached North Carolina and figure things out from there. About halfway through the trip, while I don't think we'd even crossed out of West Virginia yet, I spotted something in the distance that immediately grabbed my attention. Hidden among the trees was what looked like a massive, abandoned train station. Even from the moving train, I could tell the place had been deserted for years. The forest had almost swallowed it whole. Trees were growing right up against the old brick walls. Vines covered large sections of the building, and I could make out what looked like several rail tunnels disappearing into the mountainside behind it. I couldn't resist. Without thinking it through, I jumped off the moving train and landed terribly. One of my legs took the full impact, and the pain hit almost immediately. Even now, years later, that same leg still aches every now and then, and I'm pretty sure that jump is the reason why. Back then, though, I was 14, convinced I was indestructible, so I brushed it off, got back to my feet, and limped toward the old station as if nothing had happened. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that nobody had set foot there in a very long time. The place felt completely cut off from the rest of the world, buried deep in the mountains where nature had slowly reclaimed almost everything people had built. There wasn't a single sound besides the wind, and standing there, I had the strange feeling that I'd stumbled across somewhere people had simply forgotten. As I got closer to the station, I couldn't shake that strange feeling building in the pit of my stomach. It was this constant battle between curiosity and fear, because the place looked completely abandoned. Yet the closer I got, the more little details started telling me someone had either been there recently or was still living there. Growing up in the Appalachians, I'd heard every story imaginable about people hiding deep in the mountains. Most of them sounded ridiculous, and the few people I'd actually met over the years were nothing like the stories. They were usually homeless men who had chosen to live away from society, and a couple of them had even helped me before, after realizing I was just some kid wandering around alone. Because of that, I never automatically assumed people living in the woods were dangerous. Even so, something about that place felt completely different. Looking back now, I think my instincts recognized the danger long before my 14-year-old brain did. Every few steps I took, I noticed something else that didn't quite fit. Little details that, by themselves, meant nothing, but together created this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't have been there at all. One of the first things that caught my attention was an old rusted Ferris wheel sitting off to the side of the property. I still have no idea how something like that ended up in the middle of the mountains, but it looked like the remains of some traveling carnival that had been swallowed by the forest decades earlier. Tied upright against one of the supports was what looked like a human skeleton, its ribs and skull covered in holes, almost as if somebody had spent hours throwing knives at it or using it for target practice. At 14 years old, I immediately convinced myself it was fake. Back in my hometown, there was this weird little occult shop that sold plastic skeletons every Halloween, and I figured somebody had dragged one out there as some kind of joke. I never walked over to inspect it because it didn't seem important at the time. Now, after everything that happened afterward, I find myself wondering whether it actually was fake, or whether my brain simply chose the explanation that made the most sense so I wouldn't panic. I kept walking toward the old station anyway, even though my entire body was starting to tense up. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap somewhere behind me, or leaves shifting just outside my field of vision. The strange part was that every single sound stopped the second I turned around. It didn't feel like someone was following me. It felt like someone already knew exactly where I was and was simply watching me move deeper into the property. I seriously considered turning around more than once, but the truth is that I was 14, and I barely cared what happened to me back then. My life at home had become so miserable that I honestly didn't value my own safety the way a normal kid probably would have. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but my mind just kept finding excuses to keep going. Looking back now as an adult, I think that's probably the saddest part of this entire story. A kid who grows up believing nobody cares whether he comes home eventually stops caring too. When I finally reached the station itself, it became obvious almost immediately that people were living there. There were stacks of canned food pushed against one wall, old blankets piled into makeshift sleeping areas, empty bottles scattered across the floor, rusted cooking pots sitting over long dead fire pits, and rats feeding on scraps that looked far too fresh to have been there for very long. Somebody was using that place. There wasn't any doubt about it anymore. The unsettling part was that I couldn't actually see anyone. It was almost completely silent except for the occasional drip of water echoing through the old concrete structure. That's when my eyes drifted toward one of the train tunnels leading into the mountain. The inside was pitch black, not the kind of darkness your eyes eventually adjust to, but the kind where the light simply disappears after a few feet. I stood there staring into it far longer than I should have, trying to convince myself there was nothing inside, when I suddenly noticed movement deep within the darkness. Everything happened so fast after that even now it feels like flashes instead of memories. I saw one figure emerge, then another. Two men stepped out of the tunnel so suddenly it almost looked like the mountain itself had spit them out. They were filthy beyond anything I'd ever seen before. Their clothes hung off them in torn strips. Their hair was matted with dirt. One of them seemed to drag one leg behind him as he walked, and the other carried a thick wooden club that looked like it had been carved from a tree branch. Neither of them said a single word. The second I realized they were looking directly at me, I turned to run, but I never got the chance. Something slammed into the back of my head with unbelievable force. My vision exploded white, my ears started ringing, and before I even understood what had happened, everything went black. I have absolutely no idea how long I was unconscious. It could have been an hour. It could have been an entire day. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes inside that same tunnel. My head was pounding so hard it felt like my skull had split open, and every attempt to move sent a sharp pain through my wrists and ankles. It took me several seconds to realize I had been tied up. Everything around me was still almost completely dark, and for a brief moment, I genuinely thought I was alone. Then I felt someone grabbing my shoulders and shaking me as hard as they could. A quiet voice kept whispering at me to wake up while hurriedly cutting through the ropes around my wrists. Even now, I can't tell you exactly who that person was. I think it was a young woman because the voice sounded female, but I had taken such a hard blow to the head that my thoughts were completely scrambled. Whoever it was kept glancing deeper into the tunnel every few seconds, almost like they expected someone to come back at any moment. The only thing they managed to tell me before finishing with the ropes was that the men had gone out hunting, and that if I wanted to stay alive, this was my only chance to escape. Those words snapped me awake faster than anything else could have. The second my hands came free, they untied my ankles as well. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't stop to thank them. I didn't even think about helping them. I still feel guilty admitting that, but survival completely took over. I pushed myself to my feet, ignored the blinding pain shooting through my head and legs, and sprinted toward the tiny circle of daylight at the end of the tunnel without looking back a single time. The moment I made it outside, I just kept running. I tore through the trees, stumbled across rocks, slid down muddy hillsides, scraped my arms against branches, and never once stopped to catch my breath. Every sound behind me convinced me they had already found me again. Every snapping branch made me think those two men were only a few yards away. Eventually, I reached the railroad tracks where I jumped off the freight train earlier that day, and only then did I realize everything I'd brought with me was gone. My backpack, my food, my sleeping bag, my extra clothes, every single thing I owned had been left behind. I wasn't going back for any of it. The only reason I survived out there was because I found a small spring not too far from the tracks. Lying beside it was an old dented metal can someone had thrown away years earlier. I rinsed it out as best as I could, filled it with water over and over again, and lived off nothing but that while I waited for another train. I stayed there for a day and a half, barely sleeping, constantly scanning the tree line, convinced every movement in the woods meant they had come back looking for me. By the time another freight train finally rolled through, I was exhausted, starving, dehydrated, and terrified. Luckily, that section of track forced the train to slow down enough for me to climb aboard. Compared to everything I'd just escaped, jumping onto that train was the easiest thing I'd done all week. I rode all the way into North Carolina without speaking to a single person. When I finally got off, the headache had become unbearable, so I wandered into a public restroom hoping to clean myself up. The second I reached behind my head, my hand came back covered in dried blood. That's when I realized the blow hadn't just knocked me unconscious. Whoever hit me had split the back of my scalp open. I honestly don't remember much about the following month. It's all just fragments now. I remember sleeping on sidewalks, begging strangers for food, wandering around in a daze and feeling absolutely nothing. I had no desire to go home, no desire to tell anyone what had happened, and no motivation to do much of anything. It was like my brain had simply shut itself down after whatever happened inside that tunnel. That's one of the reasons I never judge people I see living on the streets anymore. You never know what someone has survived before your paths crossed. Sometimes people aren't lazy or broken. Sometimes they're simply trying to exist after something their mind still hasn't figured out how to process. The only reason I ever made it home was because an older woman found me sleeping outside one morning. She gently woke me up, asked how old I was, and when I told her I was only 14, I watched the expression on her face completely change. She bought me the first hot meal I'd eaten in weeks, stayed with me while I finished eating, asked just enough questions to realize something terrible had happened, and then quietly paid for my train ticket back to West Virginia. I never saw her again, and I never even learned her name. To this day, I believe 2 women saved my life. One of them untied the ropes inside that tunnel and gave me the chance to escape. The other found a scared kid wandering around North Carolina with nowhere to go and made sure he got home. I'm 33 years old now, and I still live in West Virginia. I've spent countless days hiking through these mountains since then, but I've never gone anywhere near that abandoned station again. I still don't know who those men were, what they planned to do with me, or who the person was that risked everything to set me free. I don't know whether she ever escaped herself, and that's the part that still keeps me awake some nights. Everything I'm about to tell you happened when my cousin and I were kids. I was 9 years old, and he was 12, although everyone always joked that he looked younger than me because he was so small for his age. Looking back, I can't believe how close we came to something that could have destroyed both of our families forever. It's one of those memories that never really fades. You don't think about it every day, but then something reminds you of it, and suddenly you're right back there, hearing every sound, smelling the cold mountain air, and feeling that same panic all over again. I've never forgotten it, and I honestly don't think I ever will. We weren't from Appalachia ourselves, but every fall, our families rented a cabin somewhere in the mountains for a week. It had become a tradition long before either of us had been born. My parents, my aunt, and uncle, and the 3 of us cousins all went together every single year. My younger cousin was only 5 at the time, so he usually stayed close to the adults, while my older cousin and I spent almost every waking hour exploring the woods, climbing over fallen trees, skipping rocks across streams, and pretending we were surviving in the wilderness. To us, those vacations felt like complete freedom. The campground where we stayed was actually pretty busy during the day. Families came and went constantly. There were hiking trails everywhere, campers cooking over fire pits, kids riding bikes between the campsites, and people sitting outside their RVs talking until late in the evening. It felt completely safe, which is probably why none of us ever imagined something like this could happen there. The campground itself was registered, well maintained, and surrounded by dense Appalachian forest. There was another campground about a mile away through the trees, so there were usually people somewhere nearby, even if you couldn't actually see them. Looking back though, there was one thing that made my mom uncomfortable almost from the beginning. There was a man camping by himself several sites away from ours. I don't remember exactly how old he was, maybe somewhere in his 40s. He wasn't loud or aggressive, and he never actually approached us. The problem was that he seemed to spend an unusual amount of time watching our campsite. More than once, my mom caught him staring while we were playing. Every single time she looked back at him, he'd immediately turn away like nothing had happened. My dad thought she was probably reading too much into it. My uncle said maybe the guy was just bored. Nobody wanted to accuse someone of anything based on a feeling. Still, I remember my mom mentioning it enough times that even as a kid, I started noticing him too. Around that time, there was a stupid challenge going around at school. Kids kept daring each other to sneak into the woods at midnight, stay out there for a few minutes, and come back with proof they'd actually done it. Looking back now, it sounds ridiculous, but when you're a kid, those kinds of dares feel like the biggest thing in the world. Nobody wanted to be the one who chickened out. My cousin had been talking about it for weeks before the trip, saying that if we were surrounded by thousands of acres of Appalachian forest, this was the perfect place to finally do it. I wasn't nearly as confident as he was, but I also didn't want him thinking I was scared. We spent the entire day pretending we weren't planning anything, then waited until everyone had gone to bed. We zipped our jackets up and slipped outside without making a sound. At the time, it felt exciting. It felt like we were getting away with something huge. Neither of us had the slightest idea that within a few minutes we'd be wishing we'd never left that cabin. The forest looked completely different at night. During the day, it had been beautiful. You could see the mountains stretching forever between the trees, hear birds everywhere, and spot little patches of sunlight breaking through the branches. Once the sun disappeared, though, everything became unfamiliar. The flashlight only lit a tiny circle in front of us, while everything beyond it stayed completely black. Every tree looked bigger. Every shadow seemed to move. Every little sound suddenly felt important. We walked farther than we probably should have, laughing quietly every now and then, whenever one of us got startled by something stupid like a squirrel or a branch snapping under our feet. Eventually we reached a small clearing where the trees opened just enough for the moonlight to reach the ground. We stopped there for a minute because we figured we'd gone far enough to say we'd completed the challenge. That's when I noticed someone standing between the trees. At first, I honestly thought it was another camper. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there in complete silence, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. My cousin whispered that we should probably head back before whoever it was got mad at us for wandering around. I remember nodding, but before either of us even turned around, the figure suddenly started walking toward us. There was something immediately wrong about the way he moved. He wasn't calling out to us. He wasn't asking if we were okay. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. He was just closing the distance faster and faster without saying a single word. I felt every hair on my arm stand up. My cousin grabbed my sleeve and whispered that we needed to run. The second we turned around, we heard him sprinting. I've replayed those next few seconds in my head more times than I can count. We were both running as fast as we possibly could, crashing through leaves and low branches without even paying attention to where we were going. I could hear him gaining on us unbelievably fast. My cousin was smaller than me, and no matter how hard he tried, he simply couldn't keep up. I remember looking over my shoulder for one split second and seeing the man almost on top of him. Then I heard my cousin scream. Not the kind of scream kids make when they're playing. It was pure panic. When I turned back again, the man had already picked him up off the ground like he weighed nothing. My cousin was kicking, punching, and screaming at the top of his lungs while the man tried carrying him deeper into the woods. For about 2 seconds, I completely froze. I was only 9 years old. There wasn't anything I could have done physically to stop a grown man. Then instinct completely took over. I started screaming as loudly as I possibly could. I wasn't yelling words anymore. I was just making as much noise as I could. I kept screaming over and over again while running toward the campground instead of away from it. The entire forest echoed. My cousin was screaming too. Between the two of us, the noise was unbelievable. I remember hearing cabin doors opening somewhere behind us. Then flashlights started appearing between the trees. People were shouting, asking what was happening. Almost immediately after that, I heard my dad yelling my name. The man hesitated. He looked back toward the campground, then back at my cousin. By that point, more voices were coming from every direction. My uncle was running into the woods. Other campers were yelling too. Whoever that man was, he realized he wasn't going to outrun multiple adults while carrying a struggling 12-year-old. He suddenly dropped my cousin onto the ground so hard that he rolled several feet through the leaves, then disappeared into the darkness without looking back. My dad reached us only seconds later, followed by my uncle and several other campers carrying flashlights. My cousin was crying so hard he could barely breathe. I don't think I'd ever seen my dad panic like that before. He grabbed both of us and pulled us close, while everyone else spread out through the woods trying to find where the man had gone, but he had vanished completely. The police arrived surprisingly fast once someone finally managed to explain what had happened. They searched the surrounding woods until sunrise, brought in additional officers later that morning, and interviewed practically everyone staying at both campgrounds. My mom immediately told them about the man she'd been watching since the day we arrived. Once she described him, several people from the other campground said they'd noticed someone matching the exact same description hanging around their campsites too. One family even admitted they'd felt uncomfortable because he'd spent an unusually long time watching one of their children earlier that afternoon. Suddenly my mom didn't sound paranoid anymore. Everyone realized they'd all noticed the same man independently, but nobody had acted because, by itself, staring isn't a crime. The officers took detailed statements from everyone they could find. Search teams spent hours walking the trails, checking nearby roads, and talking to people who had passed through the area that weekend. My cousin and I both described the man as best we could, but neither of us had gotten a clear enough look at his face while everything was happening. The investigation stayed open for quite a while, according to what my parents were later told, but nothing ever came from it. No arrests were made. Nobody matching the description was ever officially identified, and as far as I know, they never figured out exactly who had tried to take my cousin that night. We went home the following morning instead of finishing our vacation. None of us wanted to spend another night there. My cousin recovered physically within a few weeks, apart from bruises on his arms where the man had grabbed him. But mentally, I think both of us carried that night for a very long time. Even now, decades later, we still talk about it every once in a while. We always end up asking the exact same question that neither of us can answer. What would have happened if I hadn't started screaming? What would have happened if the adults hadn't heard us? What would have happened if that man had managed to disappear into those mountains with my cousin before anyone realized we were gone? I don't think either of us really wants to know the answer. All I know is that somewhere in those Appalachian mountains, a man came within seconds of kidnapping a child. he almost succeeded. If I had frozen instead of screaming, or if our cabin had been a little farther from where we stopped. I honestly don't believe he'd still be here today. That thought has stayed with me far longer than the vacation itself ever did. About a year ago, something happened that still turns my stomach every time I think about it. I'm at the point where I don't know what to do anymore, because this involves someone in my own family, someone I grew up loving, someone I looked up to for most of my life. And now, every time I think about him, I can't shake the feeling that something is deeply wrong. Maybe I'm connecting dots that don't belong together, but I don't think I am. The more I think about everything that happened over the years, the more trapped I feel, like every memory I brushed aside as a kid suddenly means something completely different. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, where everybody knows everybody, and families are a little different than they are in most places. People live pretty spread out, but they're still close. A lot of the people we call family aren't actually related by blood. They're lifelong friends of your parents or grandparents, people who've been around so long, they might as well be relatives. That's how my godfather became part of our family. He wasn't my uncle by blood, but nobody ever questioned it. Around here, those lines don't really matter. My godfather was the adventurous one. He was the guy who could disappear into the mountains for days, sometimes weeks, without anybody worrying too much. My parents used to joke that if he vanished into the woods, they wouldn't even think about calling the police for at least a month, because there was a decent chance he'd just wander back home carrying a backpack and acting like nothing had happened. While everyone else thought that part of his personality was stressful, I thought it was incredible. As a kid, he was my hero. I wanted to be exactly like him. Looking back now, I realize he always favored me over my older brothers. At the time, I thought I was just lucky. They were twins, always together, already old enough to have their own opinions and interests, while I was the youngest, usually by myself, always eager to impress the adults around me. Now I think that's exactly why he focused so much attention on me. I was easier to influence, easier to shape into whatever he wanted me to become. He owned a small boat, and every so often he'd take me to a tiny island hidden deep in the Appalachians. When I say nearby, I mean by local standards. It still took us nearly 2 days of hiking to reach the place where he kept the boat. The island itself was small, completely isolated, and as far as I knew, almost nobody ever went there. He used to call it his island. We'd spend several days camping there, fishing, exploring, and just enjoying being away from everyone else. Some parts of the island had caves, though, and there were areas he absolutely refused to let me enter. Whenever I asked why, he'd tell me they were dangerous, and that I wasn't old enough to understand. Things started changing when I was around 12. Little by little, I noticed the way he talked about people, especially women. At first it was subtle, just small comments about how some people deserved whatever happened to them, or how certain women needed to be taught lessons. As I got older, those comments became harder to ignore. There was a bitterness in the way he spoke that made me uncomfortable, like he carried around a level of hatred that I couldn't explain. Even my godmother seemed different around him. She barely spoke, always looked nervous, and was incredibly obedient. My parents always acted like she was the odd one, telling me to keep my distance from her because she was strange. But even as a kid, I had a feeling they had it backwards. Even with all of that, he was still the only person who took me on these trips. My brothers were actually jealous of me because they never got invited. And as the youngest kid who'd spent most of his childhood wishing he could be included in everything they did together, finally being the one everyone envied felt amazing. It made it very easy to ignore the little things that didn't seem right. The years passed, and we kept visiting the island together. By the time I turned 16, he told me I was finally old enough for him to show me something he'd never shown another person. He kept saying I was the only one he trusted with this secret, that nobody else knew about it, and that if everything went well, I'd be part of something special. Looking back now, it sounds exactly like manipulation. Back then, it sounded like the greatest compliment I'd ever received. I couldn't wait to find out what he had been hiding all those years. We planned to spend 3 days on the island. We each had our own tent, and the trip started like every other one we'd taken together. We fished, cooked over the fire, and explored the shoreline. He told me that on the 3rd day, he'd decide whether I was worthy of seeing what he'd kept hidden from everyone else. I remember feeling excited every time he mentioned it, constantly wondering what could possibly be so important that he'd waited years to tell me. What actually changed everything happened on the very first night. We had both gone to sleep in our own tents when I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't even sure what had pulled me out of my sleep, but after sitting there for a few seconds, I heard it again. It was incredibly far away, barely loud enough to make out, but it sounded like a scream. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a woman yelling somewhere across the island. I climbed out of my tent almost immediately, and my godfather came out just seconds later. He asked whether I'd heard something. I told him I was almost certain I'd heard a woman screaming, and that maybe someone out there needed help. The look on his face changed so fast, it caught me completely off guard. I'd never seen that expression before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't concern. It was disappointment, mixed with something colder that I still can't put into words. He looked directly at me and, in the harshest tone I'd ever heard from him, told me that some people didn't deserve help, especially women. I just stood there staring at him. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know how to process what I'd just heard. The hatred behind those words didn't sound like someone making an offhand comment. It sounded personal. It sounded like something he truly believed. Without saying another word, I went back into my tent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept replaying his face, the way his entire expression had changed, and the way he'd said those words without the slightest hesitation. It felt like I was suddenly standing next to a completely different person than the one I'd admired my entire childhood. The next morning, I told him I wasn't feeling well and wanted to leave. He didn't argue. He looked at me for a few seconds, almost like he already knew why I wanted to go. My godfather had always been incredibly good at reading people, and I could tell he understood that something had shifted between us. He simply told me he was disappointed in me, and that I'd proven I wasn't worthy of seeing what he'd planned to show me. We packed our things, left the island, and barely spoke during the entire trip back. To this day, I still wonder if I walked away while someone out there needed help. My relationship with my godfather never recovered after that trip. We hardly speak anymore, but I know he still goes back to that island every now and then. What was supposed to be one of the best memories of my life ended up becoming one of the darkest. And after everything I've remembered over the years, I can't stop wondering whether I came much closer to something horrifying than I ever realized. Then, last year, something happened that completely sent a chill down my spine. A journalist reached out to me confidentially and asked if I'd be willing to meet with him. He told me he was investigating a human trafficking network, mostly involving women, and that my godfather's name had come up multiple times during the investigation. Apparently, someone had given him my contact information because I was considered the person who knew him best. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop, and I spent the entire time feeling like I was betraying him. Even after everything that had happened over the years, part of me still saw him as the man I looked up to when I was a kid. But by that point, I couldn't keep ignoring all the warning signs anymore. I told the journalist everything I knew, every memory that had stayed with me, every detail that had never quite made sense. As far as I know, the investigation is still ongoing. I have a feeling it's only a matter of time before someone contacts me again.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're talking about people who set out on road trips through the Appalachian region and made the mistake of spending the night in the wrong place. From someone chasing a new opportunity who ended up being followed by a seriously creepy couple, to another person who stopped at a roadside motel during a road trip and barely made it out alive. Motels have always fascinated me. There's just something about them, and the amount of bizarre stories out there is insane. I hope you find these stories as gripping as I did when I first came across them. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. This happened 3 years ago, and it's still the kind of thing that makes me check every last corner when I'm sleeping anywhere that ain't home. Especially places that feel a bit off. I've lived my whole life in Franklin, Vermont. For folks who don't know, it's a quiet little town just 8 minutes from the Canadian border. I always loved living here. Peaceful place, good folks, but finding work here is a real pain in the ass. Especially for someone like me, who had a rough patch growing up and got stamped as the local troublemaker. No matter how much you grow up or try to turn things around, most folks won't give you a second shot. That's just the way it is in small towns. So even though I'd never really been outside of Franklin or the nearby areas, when I saw a job posting for a construction company just by the entrance to the Green Mountains state of Vermont, I didn't think twice before sending in my application. For those that don't know, that part's tucked deep into the Appalachian Mountains. I was honestly thrilled. Even living so close, I'd never been out there. Never did mountain trails as a kid, but I grew up on stories. And more than that, on YouTube videos about the place. I was real excited. I knew I had to be careful, of course, but other than that, I felt fine. The interview was set for a Tuesday, so my plan was to leave early Monday morning, spend the night there, and, depending on how the interview went, head back Wednesday. I could have made it there and back in a day easy. It was only about an hour's drive. But I wanted to take the chance to see the mountains, walk around a bit. I'd never done anything like that in my life, and now seemed like the right time. Money was tight, so I had to find somewhere cheap. I've never been picky. Long as there's a bed, I'm good. I grew up in an old beat-up house with no kind of luxury, so it wasn't anything new to me. A roadside motel was more than fine. I won't name the place because what happened next wasn't their fault, and honestly, the lady working there was really nice. Monday morning, I got my things together and hit the road. By 9:30, I was already pulling into the area. Brought lunch with me and had planned to do a short hike. Nothing serious, just about an hour's walk. When I got there, I parked the car and started up the trail, all hyped to finally be in the place I'd grown up hearing about. Couldn't believe I'd never been there before. It was beautiful. Gave me this strange, hopeful feeling, like maybe life was about to shift. Like that job might be the start of something new. That's the mindset I was in when I came across a couple maybe 15 minutes into the trail. They were sitting on a big rock. I saw them before they saw me. They were just chatting, looking the other way, and seemed relaxed. But as soon as they noticed me, their whole demeanor changed. The woman reached for her ankle right away, and the man stood up and started walking toward me. Told me his wife had twisted her ankle and that he had back problems, so he couldn't help her get down the trail to the car. I hadn't been hiking long, and that part of the trail was completely flat. Nothing rough. I was 20, in decent shape from years of construction work. So I told him sure, I could help her down to the car, no problem. I asked if she could put weight on the other leg, but she seemed pretty out of it. So I asked if she'd mind if I carried her. For a split second, it felt like that caught them off guard. Their eyes lit up just a bit. Something in their faces shifted, and it gave me pause. I wasn't sure how to take it. Figured maybe I'd misread things. I asked if I'd said something wrong. I didn't want to offend them. They both quickly said no, it was fine, and the woman got into position for me to lift her. But again, something felt off. It was like she pushed off her injured ankle to help me lift her easier. My angle wasn't great, so I chalked it up to my own nerves and went on with it. She was a little heavier than I'd expected, but nothing I couldn't handle with maybe a stop or two along the way. As we walked, they asked me some questions. Where I was from, how long I planned to stay, where I was staying. Just small talk, I thought. Didn't see the harm, so I answered. When we got back to the lot, the guy pointed to a black Toyota and thanked me again. I said goodbye and got back on the trail. I thought about them a bit. They were friendly, but something hadn't sat right. Either way, I finished the trail, had a nice lunch surrounded by trees and quiet, and soon enough they'd slipped from my mind. I spent the rest of the day checking out the town, picked up some food for dinner, and headed to the motel. I wanted to turn in early. I'm a light evening, early morning type, and I wanted to prep for my interview. The GPS said I was 2 minutes from the motel when I noticed I needed gas. Lucky for me, there was a gas station right next to the place. While I was paying, I saw a black Toyota parked in the farthest corner of the motel lot, right near the gas station. From that angle, I couldn't see the motel entrance, and anyone standing at the entrance wouldn't see that car either. I thought about the couple again. Same car, but only for a second. Just a passing thought. Then, I drove over and parked right at the front of the motel. The lot was empty, and again, from the entrance, you couldn't see that car tucked away in the corner. I found that strange. Why park that far when there's a whole empty lot? But I didn't think much else about it. The lady at the front desk was up there in years, probably close to 80, and sweet as pie. She seemed happy to see me. Said not many folks came through that time of year. There was another couple staying the night. They'd checked in that afternoon. I thanked her and headed to my room. The room was plain, just as I expected. One double bed, old but clean sheets, a nightstand with a lamp, a small sink stuck to the wall. It looked older than the photos online, but that didn't matter to me. I was tired, satisfied with my day, and focused on the next morning. Dropped my backpack by the bed, took off my sneakers and lined them up like I always do, laces tucked in. Pulled out my clothes for the next day, hung them over the chair, set my phone alarm, mentally ran through what I wanted to say in the interview, laid out my documents on the desk, and got into bed. Now, one thing I didn't mention yet is I sleep heavy. Always have. Grew up in a house with 4 siblings and parents who shouted more than they talked, so I learned to shut off completely at night. I don't wake up for noise or light, and that night was no exception. When I opened my eyes the next morning, still half asleep, caught between dreaming and waking, I smelled something odd in the room. A perfume I'd smelled before, but couldn't place. I got up, and that's when I saw the muddy footprints. Dark streaks all over the old wood floor, like someone had walked around with wet feet. I knew I didn't leave that mess. When I went to bed, the floor was clean. I sat on the edge of the bed, squinting in the morning light through the curtains. Everything looked just how I left it. Backpack in place, clothes on the chair, documents on the desk, sneakers lined up. Except the laces weren't tucked in anymore. They were out. Did I get up in the night? Was I sleepwalking? I'd never had that happen before. Not that I knew of. I walked closer. It really looked like mud. Like a wet mix of dirt and maybe moss or leaves. The window looked out back, and when I opened it, I saw it had rained in the night. The air was thick, humid, with raindrops still clinging to the trees. That meant one of 2 things. Either I was sleepwalking, or someone had come into my room while I was dead asleep. My pulse kicked up a notch. The idea that someone could be in your space, near you, when you're at your most vulnerable. It's terrifying. I wanted to believe it was sleepwalking, but it didn't feel right. I got dressed as fast as I could, my brain racing with questions. It was early, but the front desk lady was already up, reading a magazine with a cup of tea beside her. I asked her, calm, though I was boiling inside, if she'd come into my room at night. She said no, that she'd never do that. Then I told her someone had been in my room. Nothing was stolen, but there were muddy footprints on the floor. She explained the keys were all different. One room's key couldn't open another. Said this wasn't one of those cheap roadside motels where all the locks are the same. Swore up and down she'd never, ever enter a guest's room without permission, especially not at night. I thanked her and started walking back to my room, my head pounding with scattered thoughts. Then I caught movement in the window of one of the other rooms. The other couple, most likely. Someone was standing behind the curtain. But as soon as they noticed me looking, they pulled back fast. Still, I could see a silhouette behind the fabric. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to my room, packed everything like a robot, and went back to the front desk. Told the lady I was checking out early. Then I got in my car and made up my mind. I was going to wait near the gas station until I saw who was driving that black Toyota. My gut told me it was the couple I'd helped, but I needed to be sure. Needed to know why. Didn't take long. Barely 10 minutes passed, and I saw them getting into the car. No doubt about it. It was the same couple, and this wasn't some random thing. The interview didn't matter anymore. I just wanted out. Drove back to Franklin that same morning, heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. Not scared. Angry. Every black Toyota I passed after that made me jumpy. I checked my mirrors like a man being followed. Paranoid. I almost wished they had robbed me. At least then it would have made some kind of sense. But not knowing what they were doing there, that's what really messes with your mind. 3 years gone by now. Never saw them again. Still don't know what they wanted. Pretty sure I told them I was from Franklin. But maybe I didn't. I hope I didn't. All I know is I've never slept the same since. And I don't rest easy around black Toyotas. And wherever I stay, be it Vermont or the far end of nowhere, I always wedge a chair against the door from the inside. Always. About 1.5 years ago, something happened to me that, even though it didn't leave any physical marks, left scars that haven't healed since. I haven't had a proper night's sleep ever since, and I've never again stayed in a motel, or anywhere else, without doing some serious research first. At the time, I was driving through the state of West Virginia on a spontaneous trip. I had left Pittsburgh with the plan to visit a friend in Knoxville, Tennessee, and since I had plenty of time, I decided not to do the whole drive in one go. It was a trip I could have easily done in a day, but the point was to enjoy the road, stop whenever I felt like it, take pictures, and have a weekend just for myself. I'd owed myself that for way too long. I'd been burnt out, stressed from work, and just needed to breathe and break out of my routine. All I wanted was a simple road trip to clear my head and forget about the problems waiting for me at home. One thing that's important to say is, I know how tricky this state can be. Not just because of the endless stretches of road surrounded by nothing but trees, but also because of all the disappearances and the weird, messed up stuff that tends to happen. Still, it was my favorite state for road trips, so I was excited. The first and second days went by without any problems, but by late afternoon on the second day, I was way too tired to keep driving. If there's one thing you should never do, it's drive while half asleep. And luckily, I didn't have to. I was in a remote area, surrounded by mountains, narrow roads, and thick forest as far as the eye could see. I thought about just pulling over or finding a more hidden spot to nap for a few hours. But a few years ago I did that and woke up to find all 4 of my tires slashed. I wasn't in the mood for a repeat or something worse, so I kept driving until I could find the next town. I figured there had to be a place to crash for the night. Eventually, I saw a sign for a motel just 2 miles ahead. I didn't think twice. I'd never stayed in a motel before, but it couldn't be as bad as some people made it out to be. Honestly, I grew up watching Supernatural, so the idea of staying in a roadside motel was actually kind of romanticized in my head. I followed the sign, and the motel showed up soon after. Set back from the road, half hidden by tall, thick trees. It was a long, low building in an L shape, the paint peeling, the sign half burned out, with just 2 or 3 cars in the parking lot. Pretty much exactly what I expected. Old, but not destroyed. Just your standard roadside motel. Perfect for a night's rest before hitting the road again. The front office was a small room with a thick glass window and an old-school intercom. The guy working the desk looked like he came from another era. Sun-damaged, leathery skin. Honestly reminded me of a sunburned sailor. He didn't say much while I checked in. Right before handing me the key, he mentioned the windows were bulletproof. He said it like it was no big deal, but it felt weird. I half joked and asked if that was really necessary. He just said, "We're in West Virginia," with no hint of a smile. I wasn't sure if he was joking or not. I thanked him and went to my room. The key was one of those old-school metal ones with a red plastic tag, totally 80s. I was in room 7 at the far end of the building. Coincidentally, I had parked right in front of it. Inside, the room was stuffy and smelled like cheap disinfectant and damp wood. The floor was covered in a dark, worn-out carpet with unidentifiable stains. There was a double bed against one wall, a dresser with an old TV, and a small table with a metal chair. It was way grosser than I expected, so I went back to the car to grab my picnic blanket. It probably had dirt on it, but I'd take that over, lying on whatever was on that bed. It was hot, so I didn't even need to cover up, just wanted a few hours of sleep before moving on. I locked the door and double-checked it by pushing against it. It didn't feel super solid, but it would do. Took a quick shower. The water came out in weak bursts, and lay down soon after. I was dead tired, body aching from months of built-up stress. Work had been a nightmare. I was thinking about quitting, but I didn't have another job lined up and had a massive medical debt to deal with. My mind was racing with all of it, but I was so exhausted that I passed out in under 5 minutes. I'm a heavy sleeper, always have been, but that night, something jolted me awake like my body had been yanked from the inside. For a moment, I was absolutely convinced I'd been shot. My heart was pounding, chest numb, but there was no pain, no blood, just the lingering echo of a dull thud in my ears, like a gunshot had gone off in the space between sleep and reality. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out where the sound came from. The room was pitch dark, and the silence outside was so heavy it felt like it was swallowing everything. I got up slowly and moved toward the window. I peeked out through the curtain, but saw nothing. No movement, No lights, no cars. Just still trees and thick darkness. Maybe it was a dream, I thought. Maybe a door slammed somewhere nearby and my brain twisted it into a gunshot. But something didn't sit right. Especially after that guy at the front desk mentioned bulletproof glass. I lay back down. But just as I was about to get back in bed, I heard it. 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the door. Then a voice, low, muffled, but full of urgency, told me to open up. Said he wouldn't hurt me. That he just wanted my wallet and anything valuable. If I opened the door and did what he said, maybe I'd get out alive. His words echoed in my skull so loud I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my brain frozen. I stepped back, slowly, looking around the room like I could find something to defend myself with. The voice got louder, more insistent, and I heard someone jiggling the handle, pushing on the door. I finally managed to shout that I had a gun, that he didn't want to come in. But I didn't. Everything was in the car. That's when I turned to the window and saw him. He was just standing there, still as a statue, looking straight at me. He was wearing a rabbit mask. Not some cheap party mask. This thing looked realistic and disturbing. Like it was designed to make people uncomfortable. The dark eyes of the mask were locked on mine. The other guy was still trying to break in. But this one just stood there and watched, smiling like a goddamn psychopath. He could see me, and he was getting off on my fear. I stepped back without thinking, grabbed my phone, not even sure what to do with it, and ran into the bathroom, slammed the door and leaned all my weight against it. The banging on the room door was getting louder, more violent. It sounded like it was about to give. The wood was old, probably rotted. I knew it wouldn't hold. They'd be in the room any second. And that bathroom door? It didn't even close properly. Then I saw the small window above the tub. A narrow, high window meant for ventilation, not escape. It was tight, but panic gave me strength and flexibility I didn't know I had. If this had happened a year earlier, back when I still had an extra 20 pounds, there's no way I'd have fit. But the stress, the anxiety, the sleepless nights, they'd all taken a toll. And now, weirdly enough, that might have saved me. I forced my body through that window like a trapped animal. When I finally felt the cool night air hit my face, I dropped outside, into the wet leaves and gravel. I landed with a thud and was scared they'd heard me. So I got up, shaking, and ran toward the nearest tree. I didn't stop until I was deep in the woods, hidden in the shadows. That's when I finally called the cops. As I ran, I heard the room door break open. A sharp, heavy crash. A few minutes later, I was still on the phone with dispatch when I heard a scream. It sounded like a woman, but I couldn't be sure. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way and asked me to stay on the line. I never thought a stranger's voice could bring comfort, but his did. He was calm. Told me everything was going to be okay. The police showed up 27 minutes later. They said they did everything they could. But by the time they got there, the motel was empty. No sign of intruders. They took my statement and the one from the guy at the front desk. Apparently, we were the only two people there that night. But I swore to them. I saw cars in the lot when I arrived. I said it again before I got back in the car and hit the road. I drove the rest of the way in complete silence until I got to my friend's place. Two days later, the police told me there had been a gas station robbery just a few miles from the motel. 3 men were arrested. 1 got away. They asked if I could ID them, but I never saw any faces, just that mask. When they were caught, none of them had a rabbit mask. But from what they told me, they believed it was the same group. The rabbit mask was never found, and they denied being involved in the motel incident. I never heard anything more after that, and I've never stayed at a roadside motel again.